So chapter 6 is death investigation. So here we go. Um, so the first thing is investigating the scene. So the idea is that there's going to be a reconstruction of the events that preceded the onset of death. So the idea is that you have to identify what happened that resulted in the death. So the book words it weird, I feel like. But so you have to investigate the scene. So everything at the scene has to be recorded. Okay, so the photographs should be taken before the scene is altered. Things that need to be documented are blood spatter and blood flow patterns, if there's any tire marks or shoe prints, whether there are fingerprints, okay, so they need to be processed and collected. Any evidence that was discarded or dropped or cast off by the perpetrator has to be collected. And you're going to look for weapons, fired bullets, casings. Everything should be collected and documented. So all that stuff we kind of been going over. Okay, so now, cause of death. So the primary objective of an autopsy is to determine the cause of death. So common causes of death, according to the book, are blunt force injury, sharp force injury, and we're going to talk about each one of these. Asphyxia. So asphyxia is when you don't have any oxygen, and that can be caused by different things. Gunshot wounds and substance abuse. Okay, so blunt force injuries are caused by, this is funny, a non-sharpened object. So it could be like a bat or a pipe, so something that's not sharp. So things that you look for with the blunt force injury are tissue that could be scratched, so abraded. And then you're going to look for bruises or contusions. So contusions come when a blood vessel is broken in the skin or beneath the skin. Okay, so and then that blood vessel starts breaking. When it breaks, it starts bleeding, and that results in different colors. So contusions, you can't really age a bruise because different people bruise different ways, and different depths of bruises color differently. But the idea is, this is what you're looking for. So sometimes, like if someone punches someone with a ring on, the ring might leave a mark, or different things will leave different marks. So here in the book and on the slide is a picture of, I guess it's an arm, and it has a bruise, and the bruise has some abrasions in it. So they must have got hit really hard. The abrasions are kind of like a scratch. They look like a scratch, and they have scabs on them. And the bruise is purple, and then around the edges of it, it's yellow. Okay, now sharp force injuries, they're going to occur from something that's sharp. So it could be a knife or some sort of blade. A cut is when the injury is longer than it is deep. Cut, so longer than deep. And a stab is when it's going to be deeper than long. Okay, so I'm just writing that out. They're usually very bloody, right? You could look at stab wounds as defensive wounds if they're on the arm. You can really read the paragraphs in the book about it, but it talks about different kinds of defensive wounds, lower defensive wounds if they're protecting by kicking or with their arms. Okay, now asphyxia is a lack of oxygen. So there's lots of different ways that we can not have enough oxygen. So one way is by fire. Okay, so in your body, normally oxygen is carried by hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is found in red blood cells. Carbon monoxide is produced as a result of fire, and carbon monoxide has a stronger affinity for hemoglobin than oxygen does. So it binds better to hemoglobin than oxygen does. So that'll asphyxiate or suffocate you, like physiologically. So another form of asphyxia would be hanging or strangulation. So patika, which I guess I'm saying that right, patiki. So it's P-E-T-E, C-H-I-A-E. I need to look up the correct pronunciation. I always say patiki. So patiki are little teeny tiny burst capillaries. Sometimes people get it as a rash, but if you're strangled or hung, they the little blood vessels can burst in your eyes. Okay, so you have these little tiny pinpoint hemorrhaging or pinpoint bleeds, and they look red. So that's and hanging or suffocation, strangulation. Another thing is the bones, and we'll talk about the bones in lab, like the thyroid bone and the cartilages and the hyoid bone. So we'll talk more about asphyxiation and the bones that are involved in that during lab time. Okay, gunshot wounds. So gunshot wounds, they originate from projectiles fired by a firearm. Okay, so one of the things that you can tell is the patterning. So the distance a weapon was fired is one of the most important factors in characterizing a gunshot wound. So there's different kinds of patterns depending on how close you are or how far away you are when the gun is fired. So, and we can talk about that in lab too with some pictures and try to explain it. Substance abuse. So substance abuse is interesting. So it's really common, right? So if someone shows up and they look like they're a substance abuser, the forensic pathologist is going to order like a tox panel or toxicology screen to see what drugs are there, what are present, what aren't present. If someone, like an alcoholic, dies over time, right, so they've just kind of gradually drink themselves to death, that's actually labeled a natural death, because it wasn't just that the alcohol suddenly like killed them, like it was an overdose. It's a natural death over time. But like an overdose is, I guess, a little bit different. Okay, now an autopsy, basically what an autopsy is, it's the examination of body after death. So they say post-mortem. Okay, so post-mortem is after death. So the goal of the autopsy is to determine the cause of the death, to confirm the manner of the death, and it can be used in criminal proceedings or a case. Okay, so it's performed by a pathologist, the medical examiner, whoever performs it has been to medical school, but they've chosen to work in the lab with dead people rather than living people. So the medical examiner or the coroner is going to carefully examine the body to establish the cause and time of death. And so they're going to do an external examination first, and then they'll do an internal examination. So tissues and organs from the internal examination are going to be retained. So they're going to take sections of them and preserve them so that they can be examined to see the pathology, so what actually went wrong that caused them to fail, or if there were drugs or other things, toxins involved that could kill someone. Okay. So the medical examiner or the coroner is going to work with the investigator to determine what items need to be obtained from the body and sent to the lab for examination. So that's how you get all the, like, I'm just trying to think of like the Patricia Cornwell books where she always meets up with the investigator or whatever. Scarpetti, I think is her name. I guess that's right. But they always lots of books and lots of, I guess maybe movies, or there's always some relationship or some interaction between the ME and the investigator, okay, because they have to work closely together. So they're going to look at the victim's clothing. Okay, they're going to do fingernail scrapings and collect them. They're going to comb the head and the pubic hair to look for any evidence that might be in there. They'll do a buccal or buccal, depends on who you learn from, swab, which is going to be a cheek swab inside to look for DNA typing or to collect DNA so that they can use it as a standard or a reference. If they suspect it's a sex-related crime, they're going to do vaginal, anal, and oral swabs. They're going to look for bullets. They're going to look where maybe there might be a bite mark for saliva from the perpetrator. They might do hand swabs to look for gunshot residue. Okay, oh, I just said this. So here's more examples of things. So hand swabs from shooting victims for gunshot residue analysis. They'll swab areas of the body where they think they might have been in contact with something that could leave DNA or leave saliva. And then hand stubs or swabs for gunshot residue. So I kind of already said that. Okay, so the first steps for the external is going to be, they're going to look at the broad overview at the condition of the body. So what does the body look like? Like how old do they think they are? The weight, that kind of thing. So they're going to look at the overall condition of the body and the clothing. Okay, so they'll look for tattoos, color of the hair, physical condition, sex, tattoos, scars, if there's track marks from drugs, if there's any puncture wounds, if they tried to do CPR, different things at the crime scene to try to bring him back to life. They'll say, okay, they have they've been intubated, they have this tube or whatever. Okay, they're also going to look for in the nose, in the mouth, and all the cavities. Okay, now they're going to start classifying the injuries. Okay, so they're going to say, okay, well, this is we believe they have a stab wound, or they have a gunshot wound, or whatever, or it was self-inflicted cutting, or whatever. Okay, now the internal examination is going to be it's basically they're going to dissect the body. Okay, so basically what they're going to do is they're going to do a Y cut. So the Y-shaped incision, so it starts up at the shoulder bones, and then they're going to cut all the way down to the pubic bone. And they're going to take out and examine each of the organs. Okay, so they're going to weigh the organs, they're going to dissect it, they're going to section them. So sectioning them means they're going to take like thin slices of them so that they can look at them with the microscope. During that time, they're going to look for pre-existing conditions. So they might say, oh, look, this person had a heart valve replaced, or this person has pulmonary edema. They're going to just try to examine everything and try to figure out what's going on with that person to get the whole story. Okay, so they're going to they're going to take samples of the organs and also look for drugs or other toxins, right? So they're going to take some blood. They'll do stomach contents. Okay, so they'll be careful when they dissect out the stomach, and they're going to look at what's in there. So there might be drugs in there. They can try to determine how much food is digested, what food they ate. Let's see. They're going to look at the bile. Okay, so the bile comes from the gallbladder and helps with digestion. And they're also going to look at urine. Hold on, wait, I gotta make sure this stops. So there's also information in the book. It goes into detail about how they take the brain out and removing the skull cap. It's just, I mean, I don't know. That kind of stuff is just, to me, is very interesting. Okay, now, some of the drugs that people take after someone dies, they can actually leave the cells and enter the blood. So everything after death doesn't necessarily look the same as it is in life. Like things change around. Levels of things can change around. Okay, now when they classify the manner of death. Oh shoot! Did I miss a slide about toxicology? No, I guess not. Okay, so the manner of death is for the death certificate. It goes into one of 5 categories. Okay, so we have homicide, suicide, okay, accidental, natural, or undetermined. Okay, so there's 5 different manners of death, but in their broadcast, right? So, oh, I thought I would have slides about that, but I guess I took them out. Okay, so suicide is taking your own life. Accidental, it's somehow gross negligence. Something like kind of stupid happened, or something like not on purpose happened. Natural causes, and then undetermined is they can't figure it out. Okay, now estimating the time of death. Okay, so a pathologist can't give the exact time of death. There's so many variables, they can't say exactly when someone died. Okay, however, they can estimate it. Okay, so there are some characteristics. So there are these 3 things. So algor mortis is the process that happens after death, in which the body temperature, we're going to lose heat. Okay, so the goal is things always go back to homeostasis. So we always kind of come to a point of equilibrium. So algor mortis, what they're going to do is they're going to put a thermometer in. The environmental temperature and the bilateral axillary, okay, so that's under your armpit or in the ear, are recorded at the crime scene. And then they can determine the cooling rate of the body. So they say, as a general rule, the body loses heat by 1 to 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit per hour until the body reaches environmental temperature. Okay, so environmental temperature is probably between 70 and 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, now we always do everything in Celsius, but Fahrenheit. So the reason they put it under the armpit or in the ear is to not disrupt anything. So algor mortis is just the cooling of the body. Okay, livor mortis is when the blood, when you're laying down, okay, the blood is going to pool after your heart stops. Okay, so livor mortis is when the blood settles at the parts of the body that are closest to the ground. So it begins about 20 minutes or up to 3 hours on death, and it'll continue up to 16 hours. So you can see how someone was laying. And they say lividity is what they talk about. So lividity is like the pooling of the blood. So it'll look more red or purpley in some places compared to others. So you could tell whether a body was moved or not. Okay, and there's a picture, livor mortis, in the book, and it shows kind of how the body was laying and how the blood pooled. There are some redder spots compared to some whiter spots on the back. Okay, now rigor mortis. What happens in rigor mortis is your body requires energy, or ATP, in order for muscles to relax. So when you die, you quit making ATP and your muscles can't relax. So the muscles contract and they don't relax. Okay, so rigor mortis is when the muscles start contracting, and it occurs within the first 24 hours, but within 36 hours, everything starts to break down and it goes away. So the body everything will totally contract and kind of curve. Okay. Another thing, so this is a body where that's in rigor mortis. So the back is curved up off the table, and the arms are up off the table because the muscles are contracted. They're not relaxed like if you were asleep. Now it'll only last like at 36 hours at the most. Okay, now another way to estimate the time of death is to take a syringe and a needle and go into the eyeball. So in the eye, and I'll show you this in lab, in the eye there is fluid in the behind the lens of the eye. So I'm trying to draw a little picture. And that fluid is called vitreous humor. So vitreous humor, you can approximate the time of death by the amount of this ion called potassium that's in the vitreous humor. So they'll go in, withdraw some of the vitreous humor, and then and analyze the potassium concentration. Okay, another thing they can look at is stomach contents. So stomach contents can reveal what was in there and how much is actually has been digested. Okay, now decomposition isn't in there, but decomposition is a part of the book. So decomposition is when the body starts to break down. So there's two main processes, so autolysis and putrefaction. Okay, so autolysis is just when the cells start breaking down, and putrefaction is when the microorganisms start to break the body down. Okay, so that's an interesting little paragraph to read too. Okay, now forensic anthropology is examining and identifying human skeletal remains. Okay, so there's like whole degrees in anthropology, and then probably classes or maybe some degrees in forensic anthropology. Okay, so we can look at bones, and from the bones and the shapes of the bones, we can determine gender, we can determine age, we can determine race, and we can determine whether there was skeletal injury. We can also kind of determine by sizes of things, maybe like what someone did in their life, like whether they were a laborer or whether they were not a laborer, things like that. We're going to do a lab on this, so it's pretty cool. Okay, so in general, female pelvic bones are wider and more circular for the baby to pass through. Another thing that we can examine is we can look at the eye orbits and the cheeks and the chin and the different angles of them, and we can determine racial ancestry or country of origin. Okay, so like kind of almost like ethnicity of where we think the skeletons came from. Okay, so this is a female pelvis. The opening is more round, and we'll go over this in lab. The sacrum is the tailbone. Okay, it has a short, wide tailbone, so that wouldn't interfere with the baby being born. Where the male pelvis, the tailbone is longer and the opening is narrower. And we have male and female pelvises to show you. Okay, we can also look at the skulls. So the male skull is bigger. The brow bone, okay, so like above the eyes is more pronounced. It's kind of heavier. The jawbone is usually more pronounced. The cheekbones are more pronounced compared to the female. Okay, we can estimate how tall the skeleton was, or how tall the victim was, by looking at the bones, the long bones of the skeleton, like the femur. Forensic anthropologists may also be able to create a facial reconstruction. So this always makes me think of Bones. Okay, so Bones, when she was a forensic anthropologist, I think. Okay, we can also tell the age of the victim by how the skeleton is developing. And I have some pictures I can show you. Okay, so the sites where if human remains are found, they're going to be treated as a crime scene. Okay, so the scenes are secure and searched to locate all the bones. And then they're also going to look for any other evidence that might be there. Okay, now forensic entomology is really cool. So it's the study of insects and their relationship to criminal investigation. So what they're going to do, so entomology is study of insects. Okay, and forensic entomology is kind of like when a body dies and it starts to decompose, what organisms or what insects start to come into play. What appears first on the body, and how long does it take for those insects to turn into larvae and hatch and that kind of thing. So they can be used to estimate time of death. Okay, so by determining the oldest stage of a fly found on the body, entomologists determine this thing called a post-mortem interval. So the sequence of arrival of different insect species can be used to estimate PMI. So one of the most common insects is a blowfly, and blowflies are like this greenish blue color. Blowflies lay eggs into human remains, and they will hatch into maggots or fly larvae, and then they're going to start eating the tissue and the organs. So they can look at the size of the larvae and determine how long the body's been there as to when the flies landed on the body. Okay, so there are body farms. One of the first ones was at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. So that I went to school there, and my roommate when I went to graduate school there was an entomology student. So guess where she got to go? She took a forensic entomology class and a forensic anthropology class, I'm pretty sure. And she went to the body farm and collected insects from the cadavers. Okay, so they can estimate how long a body's been left out by looking at the fly larvae. There's all sorts of variables that they have on the body farm, like they do different things with the bodies to try to I guess, like pretend it's different scenarios as to what's going on with the body. It's pretty interesting. Different temperatures and things like that are going to have input into how long it takes for the flies to hatch. Okay, so here's a blowfly life cycle. So, there's an adult blowfly, and then it lays eggs, and then the eggs develop into larvae or a maggot, and then to larvae, and then the larvae mature. Okay, so there's stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, so they're getting bigger. And then after they stop eating, okay, they develop into pupa or puparium, and then that is going to develop and emerge into a mature botfly. And I'll try to find a video so you guys can see that and the timeline of how long it actually takes. So one person that was really big big is Bass. Is the guy's last name is Bass, and he was really big into forensic entomology. I think it's pretty cool, but it's also kind of gross. Okay, now, I just tried to mention this. So the time required for the development of the insects is not always straightforward, okay, because it could be influenced by geography, climate, what's going on with the weather, whether the cadaver has drugs in it or not. Okay, so if resources allow, the insects and evidence should be collected by a forensic entomology expert who's going to take temperature readings, and then they're going to know what they're doing to collect specimens, and they're going to know where to collect them. So it's just, to me, it's super interesting, but it's also very, very gross.